To the consternation of his parents, Stevie's grandmother moved in for a month. There was much play acting on their part about how wonderful it was having her for a long visit. There was much fetching and carrying of more clean linen, towels and blankets for her room. There was even the farce of a delighted call to Stevie's Uncle Phil, informing him that Grandma's staying for a while. Stevie was certain he could feel the words blocking his mother's throat. He could see the lines on his father's face, moulding their happiness into aggrieved crevices. Stevie's siblings were divided on how to respond. His sister thought that having another adult around the house ultimately offered her a greater opportunity to be pampered, while his younger brother was more cautious, noticing how the old woman ignored the little girl's antics. For Stevie, it was a treat to see the rigid routine of the house thrown into disarray, dumped into hospitality. The days now were a new world for him, shared with a woman he had grown up with and never before known. "No, little one, don't blow on it." This day she held a feather in her hand. "Breathe on it. Breathe for it." She watched him concentrate, smiling at how well he yearned to accomplish these simple tricks. Stevie did as she asked, focusing on a whisper of warm air. He forgot the old woman. He forgot the room and softly exhaled upon the tattered feather. It trembled in her palm, then hopped across its rugged terrain. It shook itself and wrestled with its stem, flopping over and over, and fluidly he sighed upon it again. A snap of wind fluffed the clotted feather in the air, straight up off the old woman's palm. It hovered there above the bed covers, wavered and swayed back and forth. It would not settle. It did not fall. It shivered one great time and burst into a blue jay. "Did I do that?" Stevie's eyes were huge with achievement. He looked from the bird to his grandmother and back again. Her smile was prim. "About time too. How am I supposed to show you the really hard things if you don't get the easy ones quicker?" Her tone was calculated to scratch him. He instantly snatched at a memory of her death, a choice one, of the witch taking his father's straight razor and slowly slicing it across her. Oh, such nonsense. It would be a very messy enterprise, my dear. Blood everywhere. Had you considered that? And in his vision, her separated artery spewed a vicious burgundy. It burbled from the wound of her throat and chugged down her front. It clung to her skin, soaked into her garment, flowed to the floor. She wrung every inch of horror from his fantasy and showed him the truth of his deed. He was terrified. Trembling, Stevie released the terrible scene of vengeance from his thoughts. He dumped his piggy bank of horrible deaths into an oblivion from where he could never call them again. As I said, it would not be pretty. She regarded him. His pallor betrayed the depth of the lesson. She felt she could not afford a moment of sympathy, and yet she reached out her hand to him, clasped it in her own. She looked at him through the fabric of their magic, the wings of the blue jay paling to gossamer. "You must learn to control yourself, little one. The gift we share is not a treasure. It is a responsibility. It is dangerous, very dangerous. Never let your feelings possess your heart, because it is in there that we conjure." Stevie watched her through the faint blue of the flapping wings, watched her eyes sadden. He saw tears beneath the filmy scrim and felt so ashamed. He'd wanted to kill her. He always had. What if, on one of those terrible occasions, he really had? The softening crack that cut her lips offered a warmth that hugged him. Thank you, little one. I know you never really meant me harm. You didn't understand. She sighed and straightened. Besides, it was better that I should bear the brunt of your experimenting. I would never have let you harm anyone. I promised myself to watch over you until you were fully aware of what you were doing. She looked at his soft hand, released it. After that, her thought drifted through the bird and kissed his forehead. Come, it's late. It's time for you to go to bed. I'll be careful, Grandma. She looked deeply at his earnestness. No, little one, but you'll learn. Stevie bore the last few hours of school with a patience recently honed by a month of new experiences. He dashed out of the class at the sound of the last bell. He called ahead to let her know he was on his way. He didn't even need to close his eyes anymore to be able to accomplish that. He just thought of her, and the image where she was and what she was in the process of doing immediately slipped into his view. I'm on my way, Grandma. She was in her room, laying the last of her possessions in the battered leather suitcase. Do you really have to leave? He saw her lean a glance over her shoulder, indulgent, and said, Yes, little one. It is time for me to go. She finished her packing, laying the floral shawl across the bottom of her bed. Little one, there is one last thing I must show you. I will wait for you here. She closed the suitcase and looked about. Raising her head impossibly high, she snorted and flushed him from the room. Stevie could see his house at the end of the last block. Sucking cold winter air into his straining lungs, he clung to the gulp, grabbed the heft of it and yanked himself through the air. He remembered the proper disengagement and exhaled through his nose as his form was sucked through the frame of his house. He felt a frenzy of exultation as his body solidified in the hallway outside his grandmother's room. Stevie could hear his mother in the kitchen scolding his brother. He knew his father had not arrived home yet. Stevie walked into his room and set down his schoolbooks and jacket. He rubbed at the chill on his cheeks as he crossed back to his grandmother's door. With an eye on the stairs, he knocked softly. Grandma, it's me. Come in, my dear. He turned the doorknob, stepped across the threshold, and felt the floor vanish from under him. He was falling, spinning, head over heels downwards. He could not gain any hold of the air that rushed past him. All he could do was scream, No! Shh! And he was upright, standing on the tractor trail beside his grandmother. What are you screaming for? She almost spat at him with annoyance, but moved away before the impulse got control. She knew she had been right to bring him to this warning. He could still be humbled by the simplest of things. She held a finger to her lips. Follow me. Not a toe touched the earth. Not a breeze rustled her clothes. Not a wisp of fabric fluttered as her frame skimmed above the ground just ahead of him. Stevie stood astounded. Come, boy! Her voice flashed through the silence of the forest, surrounded him and shoved him after her. Stevie flowed as a thought over the potholed path, skimming over dreamlight yet familiar logs and branches. As he drifted forward, behind the silent figure of his grandmother, Stevie marvelled at his new awareness. He could feel nothing. It was winter, but there was no cold, no heat, no wind, no air. He merely moved upon the softness of the earth, feeling it turn beneath him, bringing them closer to the quarry. About time, boy. Yes, the quarry. She didn't bother to look at him, but drifted deeper into the gnarling shadows. The road narrowed, slimming from trail to footpath. Stevie turned to look behind him. He could see the winter's afternoon sun upon the treetops. He could believe the real world was just beyond his reach. He was slowly enveloped in a shadow, a deepening tunnel of dark that forbade light to follow. "Pay attention, boy!" Stevie turned quickly, his breath clogged in his lungs. They now stood in the open, upon the very rim of the quarry. "I have brought you here for your final lesson." A curve of pine trees wrung the lip of the rock. A rising wind strummed through their branches, stretching boughs to slap at the ground. Below Stevie's feet, thunder rubbed within the boulders, while the sky above him disappeared beneath a field of steel-burnished clouds. Stevie looked at his grandmother. Her grey eyes were mirrors of the storm that boiled overhead. The deepening grey-green gloom clung to his shoulders, heaved itself in gusts at his tiny body. He was frightened. "Grandmother, hss!" The creature beside him was certainly not his grandmother. He couldn't move away from the gorgon whose white hissing snakes thrashed about her head. "Grandmother!" The creature seemed to inhale a greater size. It loomed over him, stretching its tendrils into the heavens. It suddenly pierced him with its focus. "See what you saw!" A gash of lightning sprung from its fingertips and snapped deep into the quarry. The bolt scratched across the body of the lake, skimming upon its black surface, and struck into the flank of the quarry wall opposite. The bruised grey above their heads broke open into terrifying detonation. The quarry was engulfed in a torrential blackness. "Do you see, boy?" And he did. Across the way, timid in the darkness, Stevie could make out the flicker of a dry flame. He knew what he saw. It was the soulful glow of the candle he had seen in his dream. Yes, boy! It was no longer fear that caused his heart to race. Stevie watched harder as the light bled into the wetness, shimmering through every drop of rain. The diamonds of the fractured candlelight seduced his imagination. "You wish to go there, don't you?" Stevie ignored the grainy tone of danger in the creature's voice. The shadow of the shack was almost obscured by the rain, but he was certain he could feel a hand on that door. Yes, the door was opening. He could tell by the widening glimmer. He could feel the swoosh of the storm sucked into the dry room. "You think it's an invitation, don't you?" Stevie vaguely felt his grandmother grab his shoulder. He was leaning into the storm. "Boy," bending to see deeper into the quarry, he could sense it. "Boy," the warm fire inside, the overstuffed chair, the folded blanket laid out for him. "Boy!" She dug her talons into his shoulder, desperate to hold him fast. The door to the shack slammed shut, the candlelight again prisoner in the gloom. Furious, he turned on her, snarling like a beast snatched from its meal. Her white eyes drew close to a hiss. "This is what you must control." Not the magic, but your hunger. You fight yourself in this. Stevie broke from the claw-like grip and stood alone in the hysteria of the elements. I want to go down. No. Stevie's grandmother clapped her hands and the light was completely engulfed by the storm. The vague contours of the shack vanished beneath the deluge of rain. Resentfully, Stevie glared at her. You continue to try me, child. The figure of his grandmother had returned to her shape. Her derision was harsh. You are selfish to the core. And one day I will let you see just how ugly it makes you. At her words, Stevie sensed something. Something inside him that slipped a leash on his hunger. Suddenly wary, Stevie eyed where the shack had been, and then his grandmother in alternating looks of unease. Softly, she bent close. Little one. Dead beneath the storm, her voice grasped his kidneys. Do not even think about it. I must forbid it. Do you understand me? He squeezed against the painful need to urinate. She was haunting him, deliberately trying to scare him away from what? Imploringly, Stevie stared up at his grandmother through the storm. His eyes were desperate to find the look of gentle reproach she always reserved behind her most fearful imprecations. Instead, she glared down at him impassively and released her thoughts on him. What he saw then left him senseless. Now in her room, the low glow of sunset held off a violet dusk. Stevie was stretched out on the great floral shawl his grandmother had tucked about him. She leaned against his side, taking the edge of the small bed for herself. Her fingers curled against the hotness of his cheek. She was looking down into his eyes, smiling her gentlest smile. I only warn you, little one. Pleadingly, she leaned into his look. Do not go there, she whispered. It would be too terrible. She touched her cheek down against his, and he trembled to feel the moistness of her tears. She raised herself from him, a wistful smile playing upon her lips. No, no one knows of this, little one. She withdrew her hand from his and touched her own palm gently. And no, not even your father. She rubbed at the spot in her palm on her hand, her eyes fastened on the floor. Neither of my children received the gift. Oh, there were the usual childhood abilities, but both grew out of them, forgot that they could once even fly. She said it sadly, brushing a memory so full of potential that had evaporated before it came to pass. For the first time, she looked at Stevie. Her slow and cradling smile brought warmth to him. You and I, my dear. Just you and I. Standing, she drew the shawl from about him and gently began to fold it into a little bundle. I know that you do not see everything as so very important. But, my dear, it is for your safety that I have warned you. Now that you are at the beginning of your own life, I cannot interfere. I can only hope that what I have offered you in this short time will be enough. Stevie was very sad suddenly, as though he'd just begun to understand a great secret, only to have the question snatched away. Can't you stay longer, grandmother? No, my pet. You must get on with it your own way. And I have to go and visit your Uncle Phil. She smiled wryly at him. Won't be half the fun. She winked. No, my dear. You're my only treasure. You always have been. She bent down swiftly and hugged him. Let's go downstairs now. Your father's home. Stevie spoke with her for many miles after she left. They exchanged oaths of secrecy. He made promises of exceptional behaviour. That's my good little one. She swore she would return in the spring, and she warned him again, her voice a mere whisper in his mind. Stay out of the... He savoured her last admonishments, as though they were pearls of honey that dropped one by one into his waiting lips. Stevie's mother came to collect him from the trance on the front lawn, but stopped and stood silent for a time, watching the steam seep from her son's lips left parted on their last goodbye. He seemed so much older to her suddenly, older and equally vulnerable. She finally stepped close and gently slipped an arm around the shoulder of her eldest. She easily turned him round to face her, unconscious of the look of surprise on her son's face. You've always been her favourite, Stevie. I'm just so proud of you. Mum? She smiled deeply at him, then held him so close against her Stevie could feel two hearts in awkward syncopation. I'm all right, Mum. Stiffly, Stevie pulled back. He watched as his mother's eyes softened to the glistening in the dusk. She smiled at him from an arm's length. You really took your time with her, Stevie. I was getting worried you never would. It would have been a shame for her to pass without you ever really getting to know her. She gazed proudly into his beleaguered eyes and melted even more when she sighted tears.